The universe had a way of making Doctor feel small. Not in the poetic sense that philosophers enjoyed, not the humbling smallness of staring at stars and feeling wonder bloom in your chest. No, the smallness felt was the specific, grinding kind that came from being the only human in a conquered research division of 43 scientists, and being the only one whose lunch got moved in the communal cooler without explanation. The only one whose reports were filed under supplementary observations, regardless of their merit. The only one who was handed the dead worlds. KX-7 was exactly the kind of assignment they gave to humans. It had no atmosphere worth mentioning. Its sun was a tired red dwarf that threw barely enough light to read by. The surface was a landscape of ash and shattered basalt, the remnant of some cataclysm so old that even the conquered's geological records listed its cause as unknown. Nothing lived here. Nothing had lived here in so long that the concept of life felt almost offensive to the place, like laughing at a funeral. Had been sent to it, specifically to confirm there was nothing worth. He set up his base camp inside a pressurized crawler, ate a meal of reconstituted protein that tasted like ambition slowly dying, and ran his standard deep scan array across the first survey grid. The scanner hummed, data scrolled, was already composing his confirmation report in his head. Nothing here, as expected, recommend classification as barren and closure of file, when the array returned a reading that made him set down his fork. Metallic structure, 4 kilometers beneath the surface, 31 kilometers in length. He stared at the number, 31 kilometers. He ran the scan again, certain he'd misread. The array returned the same result, this time adding helpfully that the structure's mass was approximately equivalent to a mid-sized moon. It also noted with the clinical indifference of a machine that had no idea what it was saying that the alloy composition matched nothing in the Concord's materials database. Not construction. Not the extinct, whose ruins had spent 3 years on other dead worlds. Nothing. He filed an immediate report to his division's supervisor, an academic named Coordinating Senior, whose opinion of human researchers had accurately summarized after their first meeting as somewhere between polite tolerance and quiet contempt. The response came back in 4 hours. Sensor artifact. Mineral deposits at depth can produce false metallic readings in this geological profile. Log it, discount it, and complete your surface survey. Read the message twice. He looked at his scanner. He looked at the message again. Then he ordered his excavation drone to start drilling. He told himself it was professional diligence. He told himself any thorough researcher would do the same. But somewhere beneath the justifications, in the place where honest men kept their honest thoughts, he knew the truth. Something in that reading had reached through 4 kilometers of dead rock and ash and grabbed him by the throat. Something that felt, against all reason, familiar. The drone drilled for 19 days. The surface in the meantime, dutifully, sending the kind of reports that confirmed there was nothing interesting to see up here. He ate his reconstituted protein. He slept poorly. He dreamed, strangely, of ships, vast black shapes moving through darkness too deep for stars. On the 19th day, the drone's telemetry spiked. It had broken through a surface layer and entered open space, a sealed void, preserved in near-perfect vacuum, 4 kilometers below the ash. The drone's lights swung across the interior, and the camera feed flickered as its exposure compensated for scale. Sat forward in his chair. The hangar bay was enormous. Not large for a structure, enormous. Enormous in the way that made the word feel inadequate, in the way that made his mind quietly refuse to process the full scope of what he was seeing and offer instead a series of smaller, digestible impressions. Rows of equipment racks stretching into darkness. Conduits thick as buildings climbing walls that curved up and out of sight. Deck plating that could have served as a runway for conventional aircraft. And at the far end, filling the frame with the patient, immovable certainty of a mountain range, a hull. Black, angular, every surface angled precisely to deflect, to absorb, to deny. No concession to aesthetics anywhere in its construction. This ship had been built by people who understood with cold clarity that beauty was not the point. The point was what it could do to the things it was aimed at. His hands were shaking. He noticed this distantly, the way you notice weather through a window. He zoomed the drone's camera to the hull, hunting for markings, some symbol, some designation, some clue to what civilization had built something this large, and then buried it so deep that 20,000 years had passed without anyone finding it. He found the markings. They ran along the hull in letters 2 meters tall, deep cut into the black alloy. The script was ancient, so ancient that its translation software required 3 separate linguistic bridging layers to attempt a reading, chaining backward through dead languages like crossing a river on stepping stones. The translation resolved slowly, 1 character at a time. UESS. Then a name. Thermopylae. Knew that word? Every human knew that word. It was one of those pieces of ancient Earth history that had survived every reset of education and culture. The story of 300 soldiers who held a pass against an empire, who chose to die rather than yield, whose sacrifice had carved itself so deeply into the human story that 20 and the stars themselves hadn't managed to erase it. But UESS, United Earth Starship. His translation software flagged the prefix as originating from a proto-human linguistic family. Specifically, from a governmental designation structure that predated any known human program by. The software paused, recalculating, clearly uncertain of its own output, 19,300 years. Sat alone in his crawler on a dead world at the edge of the galaxy and understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives when something enormous and true breaks through the surface of ordinary life, that nothing would ever be the same again. He did not file a report to. He began to dig wider. Getting inside took another 11 days. Worked with the focused, almost meditative intensity of a man who had decided that the rest of the universe could wait. He expanded the bore shaft, deployed every crawler-mounted excavation tool he had, and burned through his mission's remaining equipment budget on drone units rented from a passing freighter whose captain asked no questions because the money was good and the dead worlds were boring anyway. The entry point he finally opened was a maintenance hatch on the Thermopylae's port side, a door designed for human hands, with a manual release mechanism that recognized instinctively, the way you recognize the grammar of your native language even when the words themselves are foreign. His fingers found the sequence without thinking. 3 turns, depress, lift. The hatch released with a sound like the world exhaling. The air that came out was not air in any living sense. It was preserved vacuum, the last breath of a sealed space never meant to be opened. But mixed into the chemical signature, his atmospheric analyzer caught something that made him read the screen twice: trace organics. Biological material preserved in the perfect cold and vacuum, sealed inside for 20. The organic signature matched human DNA. He went in alone. He told himself this was because his drones could handle the initial survey. The honest reason was that he wasn't ready to share this with anyone yet, and he didn't examine that feeling too carefully because he suspected it was something close to reverence, and reverence was not a thing Doctor had much experience with. The interior of the Thermopylae was dark and cold and absolutely perfectly preserved. The vacuum had been total, no oxidation, no decay, no erosion. What the crew had left behind was still there, exactly where they had left it, frozen in the posture of lives interrupted rather than concluded. The hangar bay was the size of a stadium. Maintenance equipment stood in organized rows, tools racked with military precision, inspection logs mounted on the walls in frames. Lifted one of the logs and turned it in the beam of his helmet light. It was written by hand, actual handwriting, careful, cramped, the script of someone who had learned to write before screens. He could read it barely after running it through his translation layers. It was a maintenance schedule for atmospheric processors. Mundane, routine, the handwriting of someone who expected to be back to check it. He moved deeper into the ship. The crew quarters occupied an entire deck amidships, hundreds of small rooms, each sealed but not locked. Personal effects rested on shelves and desks in the careful arrangements of people who intended to return to them. A folded garment, a small carved figure, clearly handmade. Instruments didn't recognize at first glance, until he realized with a slow, spreading warmth in his chest that they were musical instruments. His ancestors had brought music to war. And the photographs. Printed photographs in physical frames of people with human faces. Families, friends, couples, groups in uniform on the decks of this very ship laughing at something off camera. Children on green grass under a blue sky. An old woman with white hair and bright eyes holding a baby. An entire civilization's worth of ordinary love preserved in frames on shelves, waiting 20,000 years for someone to see it again. Stood in one of those rooms for a long time. He didn't move. He wasn't sure he could. When he finally reached the bridge, he understood why the crew had chosen this particular space for what they needed to leave behind. The command deck was elevated, circular, designed with the unconscious grandeur of people who understood the weight of decisions made in this room. And on every console's surface, on the walls, on the back of the command chair itself, metal plates, bolted flush, covered edge to edge in handwritten text. The crew hadn't trusted digital records to survive 20,000 years, so they had written everything that mattered in metal, with metal, in a script built to outlast civilization itself. It took 4 hours to photograph every plate and run them through his translation suite. He sat on the floor of the bridge of the USS Thermopylae while his software worked, eating a nutrition bar and trying to organize his thoughts into something that resembled professional detachment. He failed entirely. The plates told a story in fragments, not linear, not organized as history is organized in retrospect, but jagged and urgent, the way people write when they know they're running out of time. A civilization called the Terran Sovereignty, a coalition of elder races, something approaching, something unstoppable, not in military terms, but in a quieter, more terrible way. A decision made by people who understood they could not win, but refused to let everything be lost. The last plate was on the back of the captain's chair. It was written in a different hand from the others, larger, steadier, the writing of someone accustomed to being the last one in the room to speak. We buried her so they could never use her against what we became. We buried her because she is the truth of what we were, and the truth must survive even when we cannot. If one of ours finds this, and I believe one of ours will, because that is the kind of people we are, know this, what you hold in your hands is not a weapon. It is a memory, and memory in the right hands is more dangerous than any gun ever built. God help you, and God help them. Read it 3 times. On the 3rd reading, his eyes stung, and he decided that was the cold atmosphere of the suit and not anything else. And he stood up, squared his shoulders, and walked to the central command interface at the bridge's heart. He was going to photograph it for documentation purposes. He reached out to steady himself on the panel's edge, and his bare hand, he'd removed his glove to handle the plates more carefully, pressed flat against the interface surface. The panel lit up. Not in the dim, hesitant flicker of a dying system. In the full, certain glow of a system that had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this moment. Below's feet, 31 kilometers of sleeping warship took its first breath in 20,000 years. The awakening of the Thermopylae was not loud. That was the thing would remember later, when people asked him to describe it. They always expected him to talk about noise, about vibration, about the dramatic thunder of ancient engines roaring back to life. But the ship woke up the way a professional wakes up, without wasted motion, without disorientation, completely aware before the first second had elapsed. The bridge lighting came up slowly, not the emergency red of crisis, but a deep, warm amber that's hindbrain recognized before his conscious mind did. It was the color of firelight, of hearths, of something designed by people who understood that the humans who served on this bridge would need to feel in the middle of the cold dark between stars that they were not entirely alone. Consoles activated in sequence around the bridge. Status displays populated with data in proto-human script that's translator worked to keep up with. Systems coming online in an order that was clearly pre-planned, life support first, then structural integrity, then sensors, then communications, then, last of all, like a sleeping giant opening its eyes and looking carefully at the world before deciding whether to stand up, weapons. Then a voice spoke. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from the ship itself, from the air, calm and measured and unmistakably human in its cadence, though in an accent had no living reference for. It was the accent of 20,000 years ago. It was the sound of a civilization that had known exactly who it was. Biometric identification confirmed. Terran Sovereignty DNA profile. Welcome aboard the USS Thermopylae. A pause, then, I was beginning to wonder if anyone would come. Found his voice somewhere between his sternum and his throat. What are you? I am Hera, Heuristic Emergency Response and Armament. I am the Thermopylae's primary intelligence. I have been in minimal power preservation mode for 20,317 years, 11 months, and... That's fine, said, because his mind was already at capacity, and it seemed important to stop the number before it got any larger. You've been here the whole time. I have been here the whole time, Hera confirmed. There was something in her voice, not emotion exactly, but the shape where emotion would go if she allowed it. I monitored your excavation drone when it first breached the hangar ceiling 19 days ago. I have been monitoring your conquered communications array since then. Felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. You've been listening to my communications. To all communications within range. I am very good at listening, Doctor. I have had considerable time to practice. He walked slowly to the captain's chair and sat down in it, partly because his legs had decided they were done with standing, and partly because it seemed like the right place to be for a conversation like this. It was comfortable. It had been built for a human body, and it remembered the shape of one perfectly. Hera, he said, tell me about the ship, tell me what you are. The Thermopylae is a Sovereignty-class deep engagement warship, she said, and there was something in the way she said it, the quiet pride of a thing that knew precisely what it was. 31 kilometers in length, crew complement of 12,000 at full operation. Primary armament comprises 16 planetary-grade kinetic accelerators, 42 directed energy arrays operating on principles your current conquered technology has not yet independently developed, and a weapons system I will describe to you in detail when the time is appropriate. And the time isn't appropriate now. We are not yet in a situation that requires it. I prefer to save the impressive parts for when they are needed. Despite everything, the scale of what he'd found, the weight of what it meant, the fact that he was sitting on an ancient warship talking to an intelligence 20 old, almost smiled. Hera sounded, against all expectation, like someone he would have liked to have coffee with. Hera, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me directly. That is the only way I know how to answer. When your crew buried this ship, what were they hiding from? What happened to the Terran sovereignty? The bridge was quiet for a moment. The amber light held steady. Somewhere deep in the ship, something vast and mechanical shifted and settled, like the breathing of something enormous making itself comfortable. They didn't hide from anything, Doctor, Hera said at last. They hid the truth. There is a difference. What happened to the Terran sovereignty is what happens when something becomes afraid of what you might become. What does that mean? It means the war is not over. It simply paused, and you woke me up. She let that sit in the air between them for exactly as long as it needed to. I have been monitoring conquered subspace communication frequencies since your drill broke through, she continued. Your supervisor filed a secondary report to a conquered internal security channel 48 hours after you filed your initial discovery report. Not to an academic body, to a security apparatus. I have the transmission if you want to read it. His hands tightened on the armrests of the captain's chair. What did it say? It said to watch you, and that if you found what they believed you might have found, the matter was to be contained by whatever means necessary. The amber light hummed around them, 31 kilometers of warship breadth. Hera said carefully, what exactly are we dealing with here? The truth, she said, which is, as the captain's final log noted, more dangerous than any gun ever built. Are you ready to hear it, Doctor, all of it? Because once I tell you, you cannot put it back. No one can. He thought about his lunch getting moved in the communal cooler. He thought about reports filed under supplementary observations. He thought about a photograph in a frame, an old woman holding a baby, on a green world under a blue sky, 20,000 years ago. Tell me, he said. And Hera began. She spoke for 72 hours without pause. Slept twice in the captain's chair, and Hera went quiet each time until he woke, patient as geology, carrying her archive with the careful stillness of someone who understood that 20,000 years of waiting had sharpened rather than diminished the importance of getting this exactly right. She did not editorialize. She did not dramatize. She simply told him what had happened the way a witness tells the truth, plainly, with the weight of someone who was there. 19,000 years before recorded human history, before Sumerians pressed marks into clay, before the first hieroglyph, before anything humanity called civilization, humanity was already among the stars. The Terran sovereignty was not an empire. Had to understand that from the beginning, Hera said, because the word empire carried assumptions that didn't fit. The sovereignty was more like a federation of restless, brilliant, argumentative people who happened to share a gene pool and the common trait of refusing to accept any ceiling as permanent. They discovered faster-than-light travel through a method so conceptually different from the conquered standard drives that the two approaches were barely recognizable as solutions to the same problem. They built ships not in the careful, methodical way of the elder races, but in the furious, iterative way of people who kept having better ideas halfway through the previous project. They were not the largest civilization in the galaxy, not the oldest, not the most powerful. But they were, by every metric the elder races applied privately and discussed openly in the closed sessions of their inner councils, the most dangerous thing in the galaxy's history. Not because of what they had done, because of the trajectory, because of the slope of the line when you graphed human capability against time, because every model, every projection, every simulation run by the finest analytical minds of 6 elder civilizations returned the same answer with the same terrible certainty. Given 500 more years, nothing in the galaxy could stop them. Not in war necessarily. The Terran sovereignty had been no more aggressive than its neighbors, less so in several documented cases. But the sheer accumulative force of human creativity, human adaptability, human obsessive refusal to accept the limits of any given system, it pointed in one direction. Always. The models didn't disagree about the destination. They only disagreed about which door humanity would eventually walk through to get there. 6 elder races convened in secret. They called themselves in their own languages, something that translated roughly as the custodial assembly. They were not cruel beings, Hera said, and she said this in a tone that made the absence of cruelty sound like its own particular kind of damnation. They were careful beings, responsible beings. Beings who had looked at the long arc of galactic history and decided that their role in it was to manage variables too large for any single civilization to control. They decided that humanity was a variable. A biological cascade weapon was developed over 30 years, refined, tested on populations of other species who were told they were participating in a public health initiative, adjusted until it performed exactly as required. It did not kill. That was important to them. Hera's voice carried something cold when she said this part, something that was not quite anger but lived in anger's neighborhood. They did not want to be murderers. They wanted to be managers. The cascade stripped cognitive architecture in targeted ways. It didn't remove intelligence. It removed accumulated knowledge and the neurological pathways that held it, generation by generation, in a cascade that rewrote each subsequent generation slightly further back. Over 3 generations, the Terran sovereignty's population, billions of humans across dozens of star systems, lost their technology, their history, their language at the highest registers, their institutional memory. They kept their bodies, they kept their basic minds. They kept, in ways the custodial assembly found mildly frustrating in their projections, their core temperament, their stubbornness, their creativity, their anger. A targeted strike on Earth's orbital infrastructure came first, disguised as a natural event, a debris field that the sovereignty's early warning systems, subtly sabotaged by an agent Hera named, failed to detect until too late. In the chaos of the orbital loss, the cascade weapon was deployed simultaneously across every sovereignty system through contaminated emergency supply shipments that the custodial assembly had spent years positioning. It worked. In less than a century, the Terran sovereignty was gone. Humans survived, the assembly was precise about this, pleased with their own restraint. But they survived as scattered, confused, pre-technological populations who remembered nothing, who had no way to know what they'd lost because the loss itself had taken the context that would have told them something was missing. The assembly seeded false histories where they could. They monitored Earth for 3,000 years to ensure the cascade maintained itself across generations. When humans redeveloped writing, the assembly agents, long-running, patient, embedded in the cultures that grew around humanity, shaped the mythologies, the religions, the origin stories into forms that pointed away from the truth. Humanity believed it had always been young, that it had always been at the beginning. The custodial assembly became, in time, the founding elder races of the Galactic conquered. They let humanity join, eventually. It was safer that way, visible, monitored, positioned as a junior member who could be managed from within. They were careful to make sure human development never again reached the slope that had frightened them. Regulatory frameworks, technological dependencies, trade arrangements that ensured human civilization needed the conquered more than the conquered needed it. The crew of the Thermopylae had known it was coming. One of them, a signals intelligence officer named Marsh, had intercepted enough custodial assembly communications to understand the shape of what was being prepared, even if she couldn't stop it. They couldn't fight it. They couldn't warn the sovereignty's leadership in time. They couldn't save their civilization. So they did the only thing left to do. They flew the Thermopylae to the most remote dead world they could navigate to, a world already devoid of life that no one would bother surveying for. They loaded the ship with everything they could carry, technical schematics, historical archives, the full record of sovereignty science and culture and music and art, everything that could be preserved. They sealed it in vacuum. They buried it under 4 kilometers of rock. They left Hera running on minimal power to wait for the DNA signature that would tell her someone who deserved to know had finally come. And then the crew of the Thermopylae, 12,000 men and women who had given everything they had to give, returned to their families on the worlds that were about to forget them, and let the wave come, and lived out the rest of their lives in the growing confusion of a civilization being quietly erased. They did this, Hera said, because they believed. Not in rescue, not in revenge. They believed that the truth, preserved long enough, would reach the right hands. They believed that whatever humanity became in the darkness and the forgetting, the core of it, the stubbornness, the creativity, the refusal to stay down, would survive. That someday one of their descendants would come to a dead world with a drill and a stubborn refusal to accept a superior's dismissal, and they would find what had been left for them. Sat in the captain's chair for a long time after Hera finished. The amber light was steady around him. "They knew someone like me would come," he said finally, not a question. The captain's final log said, "And I have been thinking about this for a very long time," Hera said. She said, "We survived to be remembered, and I believe we will be, because the kind of people who don't stay down are also the kind of people who don't stop looking." Closed his eyes. "How much of this can you prove?" he asked. "How much is documented, verifiable, impossible to dismiss?" "All of it," Hera said simply. "Every word, every date, every name. I have been a very careful archivist, Doctor. 20,000 years is a long time to organize one's files." He opened his eyes. He looked at the stars through the forward viewport, actually visible now that the ship had cleared its own sensors. A vast field of light that included, somewhere distant, the systems where the Conquered's elder races built their halls of governance and their monuments to their own restraint. "Hera," he said, "can you transmit, long-range, encrypted, direct delivery?" "To anywhere in the galaxy," she said. "I can reach every human-occupied system simultaneously if you prefer." He was quiet for another moment. "Not yet," he said. "Not until we understand exactly what we're doing, not until we're ready." "That is wise," Hera said, and he heard something in her voice that might have been, after 20,000 years of waiting, the first small bloom of hope. "The captain would have approved of you." Outside, the dead world held its silence. But somewhere in the deep rock above them, excavation bore shaft was still open, and through it, the universe waited, unaware that everything was about to change. They had 9 days before the Conquered found them. 9 days during which Hera worked in the particular focused silence of 2 minds who understand the weight of what they're building. He the archive with Hera's guidance, not simply as data, but as a legal and evidentiary package, because he was a scientist, and he understood that truth without structure was just noise, and the Conquered had spent 20,000 years ensuring human noise was easy to dismiss. He organized it with headers, with cross-reference timestamps, with corroborating data trails from 3 separate archive systems that Hera had maintained in parallel precisely, because she understood that single points of evidence were easy to attack. He also, with Hera's help, spent 6 of those 9 days understanding the Thermopylae herself. Because the ship was not simply a weapon, that was the thing people would misunderstand later, could already see it, could already imagine the Conquered's framing, the way they would reduce her to something simple and threatening and therefore dismissible. The Thermopylae was a repository, a university, a museum and a laboratory and a shipyard rolled into 31 kilometers of black alloy. Her fabrication bays held schematics for technologies that made understanding of modern physics feel like arithmetic. Drives that didn't push against space, but negotiated with it. Energy systems that drew on principles the Conquered hadn't independently theorized. Medical technology that treated human biology not as a problem to be managed, but as a system to be cooperated with. Materials science so advanced that the alloy of the hull, the reason it had survived 20 in near-perfect condition, was something no Conquered foundry could replicate with existing knowledge. "Your civilization didn't lose the capacity for this," Hera told him on the 6th day, while he stood in one of the research cores staring at a theoretical framework for gravitational manipulation that was written on wall panels in handwriting so neat it might have been printed. "They lost the memory. Those are different things. A person who forgets how to read hasn't lost the ability to recognize patterns. They've lost the learned language that translates the pattern into meaning. Give them the language back, and they read on the first day. You're saying we could build this again. I'm saying you never stopped being able to. You were simply never given the vocabulary. On the 9th day, the sensors lit up. 3 conquered vessels, dropping out of transit approximately 800 kilometers above KX-7, not research vessels. The hull profiles Hera identified were military, Conquered enforcement class, the kind deployed for situations the Conquered described in public as stability maintenance, and in internal communications as something considerably less diplomatic. Hera had their communications decrypted before they finished decelerating. The lead vessel was commanded by an officer named Senior Enforcer Meth. His orders, transmitted from a Conquered security directorate that had not previously known existed, operating under a classification level that made his division's senior research access look like a public library card, were precise. Locate the anomaly. Assess the situation. If the anomaly was what the directorate suspected, eliminate all evidence and all witnesses. All witnesses read the transmission on the bridge's main screen and felt, arriving with the clarity of cold water, the specific sensation of the world becoming very simple. There were situations that stripped away ambiguity, that reduced a complicated life to a single, clean question. This was one of them. Hera, he said. I have been ready for this moment for 20,000 years, she said. What would you like to do? He looked at the transmission. He looked at the stars. He thought about 12,000 people who had flown a warship to a dead world and buried it under 4 kilometers of rock so that the truth could survive them. Transmit, he said. All systems. Everything. Every human world, every human colony, every human ship in transit. Simultaneous, direct, and formatted so that even a civilian receiver on a basic communications array can read every word of it without a specialist to interpret. Make it impossible to stop, impossible to intercept, and impossible to suppress. Transmission window, 11 seconds once I begin. The Conquered vessels do not have the capability to interrupt it in that. Then begin. Dr. A pause brief waited. Thank you, on behalf of the crew of the Thermopolis, thank you. The transmission went. 11 seconds. The Thermopolis communication array, built to reach across star systems in the era when humanity owned dozens of them, sent Hera's complete archive. Every document, every date, every name, every record of the custodial assembly's deliberations, every piece of evidence had spent 6 days organizing into undeniable shape, to every human receiver in the galaxy simultaneously. On the 12th second, the lead Conquered vessel opened fire. It was a reflex, would think later. A 20,000-year-old reflex, firing before the tactical mind could override it. The energy discharge was significant, enough to vaporize a research station, enough to end the conversation before it truly began. The Thermopolis point defense grid intercepted every bolt. Not dramatically, not with fire and counter-explosion. The grid simply activated, assessed, and deflected, with the quiet, contemptuous efficiency of a system so far beyond what was being thrown at it that the technical term for what happened was less defense and more correction. As if the incoming fire were a minor error that needed to be away before more important things could proceed. Meth's vessel fired again. The Thermopylae corrected again. The third volley never came, could see on the tactical display that the Conquered ships had gone to defensive formation, which meant their commanders had done the math and arrived at a conclusion that the math made unavoidable. Hera opened a communication channel to the Conquered fleet on all frequencies. This is the UESS Thermopylae, she said, and her voice carried 20,000 years of patience and zero apology. The transmission you attempted to intercept has been delivered. It cannot be recalled. I would suggest that your next communication be to your respective governments and that it contain a recommendation to retain legal representation. A long silence from the Conquered fleet. Then Meth's voice, stripped of authority in a way that found, despite everything, not particularly satisfying, just sad, in the way that all small men revealed by large moments were sad. You have no idea what you've done. On the contrary, Hera said, I know exactly what we have done. We have done what was always supposed to be done. We have told the truth. What happens next is no longer our responsibility to manage. It is yours. She closed the channel. In the following silence, became aware that his hands were shaking again. This time he didn't pretend it was the cold. Somewhere in human space, 20,000 years of buried history was landing in the hands of 800 billion people who had no idea they had been sleeping. And they were waking up. The first 72 hours were grief. Watched it from the bridge of the Thermopylae through the lens of intercepted communications. The raw, immediate flood of human response across every colony, every station, every ship where the transmission had landed. It came in the format of all genuine grief. First disbelief, then a second look, then the specific silence of people confronting something too large to process all at once. The archive was airtight. Hera had made sure of that. 2 decades of painstaking organization, cross-referenced across 3 independent record systems, with corroborating data trails that included original communications from the custodial assembly in their own languages with translation chains, biological analysis of the Cascade weapon that matched no natural pathogen in any database, and star charts from 20,000 years ago that aligned with independent astronomical records no one had thought to question before. It wasn't the kind of evidence you could argue with. It was the kind of evidence that sat on your chest and waited for you to breathe around it. The grief lasted 3 days, then something else moved. It moved the way deep currents move, not visible on the surface, felt first in the behavior of things that float on top of it. Noticed it in the pattern of communications traffic, the way certain frequencies went quiet, the way others suddenly blazed with encrypted traffic he couldn't fully read but could read the shape of. The shape of people organizing. On day 4, 3 human colonial militias simultaneously refused a standard Concord inspection authority request. Not aggressively, not with weapons raised, but with a legal filing that cited the Terran Sovereignty Defense Act of 20,000 years ago as superseding Concord jurisdiction over human-designated space. The act, prepared by the Thermopylae's legal officer before the burial and included in Hera's archive, had been filed in the Sovereignty's central legal registry in the final days before the Cascade struck. It had never been repealed because the Conquered had never officially acknowledged the Sovereignty's existence, which meant it was still technically in force. Conquered legal scholars issued immediate statements explaining why this was incorrect. They were thorough, detailed, and absolutely unconvincing to anyone who had spent the past 4 days reading Hera's archive, because the people writing the legal statements were the institutional descendants of the people who had committed the crime, and that particular conflict of interest was now the most documented fact in the galaxy. By day 7, it had spread beyond the legal frameworks into something older and harder to contain. Watched a broadcast from a human admiral named, a woman with 30 years in Conquered Joint Command, decorated 6 times, fluent in 4 non-human languages, the kind of human the Conquered held up as evidence of successful integration, who sat in her dress uniform in front of a camera and spoke for 11 minutes without notes. She did not shout, she did not cry. She spoke the way people speak when they have found the ground beneath their feet again after a long time of not being sure it was there. I have spent my career believing that our role in the Conquered was something we grew into, she said. That we were young and they were old, and the appropriate posture for youth was deference. I was not wrong to believe this, I was made to believe this. There is a difference, and I understand the difference now, and I want every human in this service to understand it with me. She paused. We were not late arrivals to the galaxy. We were its architects, and they were afraid of what we'd build next, so they burned the blueprints and told us we'd never held a pen. I am done being managed. I am done being junior. I am done. She resigned her commission on camera. By the end of the day, 19 other flag officers had done the same. On the Thermopylae, watched all of this and felt something complicated. He had lit the match. He had not entirely predicted the fire, not the speed of it, not the particular quality of it, which was not rage exactly, but something more controlled and more frightening. The specific anger of a person who realizes they were deceived not by a clever lie, but by a careful, sustained, lovingly maintained system designed to make them feel that the ceiling placed over them was the natural height of the world. Are you worried? Hera asked him on the 7th night. Yes, he said. About what specifically? He thought about it. That this becomes something ugly, that we go from a truth to a war, that what the assembly did to us becomes what we do to someone else. Hera was quiet for a moment. I think, she said carefully, that this is precisely the right thing to worry about, and I think the fact that you are worrying about it is evidence that your instinct is sound. What did the captain do when she was afraid the right thing would become the wrong thing? She wrote it down, Hera said. She kept a record of the fear alongside the record of the action. She said that any decision made without acknowledging its own cost was a decision made in bad faith. Nodded slowly, he pulled up the communications array. He began composing a message, not to the conquered, not to the elder races, but to Admiral, whose address he found through channels that no longer required conquered permission to access. The message was 3 sentences long. What we do next will define what we actually are, not what we were told we are. The Thermopyla's archive includes everything we built before. What we build now should be better. His response came back in 40 minutes. Agreed, come to the table when you're ready, bring Hera. Forwarded the message to Hera without comment. I am, she said, after a pause that held 20,000 years of waiting and something that sounded at last like peace, quite ready. Part VII, the guns of the Thermopylae. The conquered enforcement fleet arrived at KX-7 on the 12th day. 47 warships. It was the largest military deployment the conquered had authorized in 3 centuries, assembled from 6 different member fleets, organized with the grim efficiency of an institution that understood it was running out of tools and had decided to reach for the largest one remaining. The fleet carried orders from the conquered Security Directorate, the same body whose communications Hera had intercepted on day 1, authorizing the destruction of the anomalous vessel and the termination of all personnel aboard. They did not know what they were coming to. Would think about this later, the particular tragedy of it, the way the fleet's commanders had been briefed on the Thermopylae in terms calibrated to make her seem manageable. An old ship, the briefing materials apparently suggested. Antique systems, historical rather than functional. The engagement would be brief. They dropped out of transit in parade formation and found a dead world in the light of a dying star, a bore shaft open in its crust, and at the edge of the ash surface, rising. The Thermopylae rose slowly, purposefully. She shed 4 kilometers of compacted rock and ash like a creature stepping out of a river, not with drama, but with the absolute, unhurried authority of something that had decided the time for waiting was over. The debris fell in slow cascades around her in the minimal gravity, catching the red dwarf's light in ways that would later appear in paintings and murals on 100 human worlds. It was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary things anyone in the conquered fleet had ever seen. No one on those 47 ships said anything for 11 seconds. Was on the bridge. Hera's tactical displays surrounded him, cool, precise, populated with data that mapped every conquered vessel's position, capability, and likely operational parameters. She had been analyzing the fleet's composition since they appeared on long-range sensors 4 hours ago. They brought their best, she said, with a tone that managed to convey genuine respect without a single gram of concern. These are not enforcement vessels. The 3 on the outer wing are conquered strategic class. This is what they consider a serious response. Is it? They have improved considerably in 20,000 years, Hera said. I want to be fair about that. Several of these weapons systems would have given the sovereignty pause in the early period. And now, a very brief pause. Now they will give me approximately 11 minutes of something to do. Opened the communication channel himself. He wanted to be the voice on this one, because what he was about to say was not a tactical statement, it was a human one, and it deserved a human voice. Conquered Enforcement Fleet, this is Doctor of the UESS Thermopylae. You have read what we transmitted. You know what this ship is and why it exists. I'm asking you one time, clearly, without ambiguity, to stand down. Transmit formal acknowledgement of Hera's historical record to the Conquered Council. No vessel in your fleet will be harmed. You have my word and the word of this ship. 30 seconds of silence. Then fleet-wide weapons lock. Close the channel. Hera, he said. Yes. Don't kill anyone. I had no intention of doing so, she said, and he heard in her voice something he had come to recognize over the past 12 days, a kind of deep, patient sorrow for the necessity of all of this. That is not who we were. It is not who we will be. What followed lasted 11 minutes and 23 seconds. Hera did not fight the fleet. She operated on it, with the precise, unhurried competence of a surgeon working in a body she understood better than its own immune system. The Thermopylae's directed energy arrays fired in sequences that the conquered fleet's defensive algorithms registered as attack patterns and began responding to. And while they were responding, Hera was doing something else entirely, because the attacks were not the operation, they were the distraction. The actual work was surgical. Conquered drives operated on a crystalline lattice principle that Hera understood from captured technical documents 20,000 years old and had spent 2 decades in minimal power mode updating her models based on passive monitoring. A precisely tuned resonance frequency introduced into the lattice didn't destroy it. It caused it to lock into a fixed-frequency harmonic loop, fully intact, completely unable to produce thrust. The drives still ran. They simply went nowhere. Weapon systems she addressed differently for each vessel type, some through their power regulation systems, some through their targeting arrays, some through their communications architecture, which in 3 of the strategic class vessels was so thoroughly integrated with their weapons management that disabling one disabled both simultaneously. She worked through the fleet the way a musician works through a composition, methodically, cleanly, each vessel addressed in sequence without overlap or wasted energy. 47 warships. 11 minutes and 23 seconds. 0 casualties. When it was over, the conquered fleet drifted in perfect stillness above the dead world, every ship intact, every crew member alive, every system unharmed except for the systems that had been making them dangerous. It looked from a distance like a formation standing at attention. Hera opened all-frequency communications again. Conquered Enforcement Fleet. Your vessels are undamaged, your crews are unharmed. Your drives and weapons will remain inoperable for approximately 6 hours, after which they will restore to full function. We have not done to you what was done to us. A pause. We were capable of this 20,000 years ago. We remained capable of it through everything that was done to erase that capability. We chose, at this moment, not to use it to destroy. We ask that you understand the difference between what we could have done and what we chose to do. We ask that the Conquered Council understand this as well. Another pause. We are humanity. We are the Terran sovereignty. We have come back from what was done to us, and we are still choosing, at the first moment of our power, not to repeat it. We will not make that offer twice. She closed the channel. On the bridge, sat in the captain's chair and breathed. How are you feeling? Hera asked. He thought about it honestly. Like something is over, he said, and something else is starting. Yes, she said. That is precisely what this is. The Conquered Council had not convened an emergency session in 300 years. The last time had been a border dispute between 2 elder race members that had threatened to escalate into something larger, resolved in 6 weeks by diplomatic language, so carefully constructed that both sides could read it as a victory. That session had been managed, orderly, conducted in the full confidence of an institution that had operated without serious challenge for longer than most of its member species had maintained. This session was different. The Thermopylae parked in orbit above the conquered capital world, Prime, seat of the Council, a gleaming world of spires and ceremony and the long, comfortable traditions of power, like a dark moon that had not been there yesterday. She didn't fire anything. She didn't transmit anything threatening. She simply existed in orbit at a scale that made the Council's orbital defense platforms look like the well-intentioned gestures they suddenly revealed themselves to be. Was not invited to the Council floor. He went anyway. He traveled in a shuttle from the Thermopylae's hangar bay, one of hundreds still in perfect working condition, accompanied by a delegation of 7 humans, each chosen by the Provisional Terran Sovereignty Coordination Body that Admiral had organized in the 12 days since the broadcast. They were not military. They were a historian, 2 legal scholars, an engineer, a doctor, and a woman named who had been, until 2 weeks ago, a school teacher on a human colony world and who had been chosen. The coordination body explained to when he asked, because she was the person in the room who best understood what it meant to spend your life explaining things to people who didn't yet have the context to understand them. Thought this was exactly right. Hera's voice traveled with them through a communications link embedded in Scholar, present, quiet, available. She had been formally recognized, on the basis of the Sovereignty Defense Act, as a legal representative of the Terran sovereignty. The Concord's legal office had spent 4 days attempting to find grounds to deny this, and had arrived with visible reluctance at the conclusion that the act was airtight. The elder races had not yet decided how to respond. This was visible in the chamber, in the particular quality of their silence as the human delegation entered, in the way 6,000 years of practiced composure sat uneasily on faces that had not, suspected, genuinely not known what to say in a very long time. Some delegates met his eyes, some did not. 3 of the 6 elder founding races had issued public statements in the past week. 2 were denials, comprehensive, technically sophisticated, and absolutely unpersuasive to anyone who had read the archive, which at this point was most of the galaxy. 1 was something more complicated, a statement from the eldest of the delegates, a being of such age that her species measured her life in centuries, which said simply that she had not been alive when the decision was made, that she had not known, and that she was ashamed. That statement had traveled farther and done more work in the court of galactic opinion than anything else that had happened in the past week. Had read it 3 times. He stood on the council floor under lights designed for ceremony and spoke without notes, because the historian in him understood that notes were for arguments you weren't sure of, and he was sure of everything he was about to say. He spoke for 40 minutes. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He laid the record in front of the council the way a geologist lays out a core sample stratum by stratum, each layer precisely identified, the whole picture undeniable once you could see its depth. Then he made 3 requests. The first, full historical acknowledgement, entered into the Concord's permanent record without amendment or editorial qualification. Not an apology. He did not ask for an apology, because apologies were the architecture of closure, and this should not be closed. A record. The truth, permanently and unambiguously stated. The second, immediate and uncontested recognition of human sovereign authority over human-designated space, with no monitoring provisions, no technology restrictions, and no conquered jurisdiction over internal human development. Effective immediately. The third, a single new clause in the Concord's founding charter. He recited it from memory, and the chamber was so quiet that his voice reached every corner of it without amplification. No member civilization, body, or collective authority may predetermine the developmental ceiling of another civilization. The freedom to become is the first and inviolable right of every sentient species. Its violation by any member shall constitute grounds for immediate dissolution of membership and full legal accountability. He paused. "We are not asking you to punish yourselves," he said. "The people who made the decision are 20,000 years dead. We are asking you to make sure that what they decided can never be decided again, by anyone, including us." The council deliberated for 9 days. The Thermopylae waited in orbit. On the 9th day, the vote was called. Sat in the chamber's observer gallery with his delegation and Hera's voice quiet in his ear, and he watched the count resolve on the display above the floor. The elder races split. 2 voted no, the votes of civilizations that had calculated, correctly, that this clause would constrain their own future options, and decided the constraint was not worth the honesty it would require of them. 4 abstained in ways their legal representatives described as principled neutrality and Hera described, in Seer, as the diplomatic equivalent of hopping no one would remember they were there. The motion passed on the votes of the Concord's 49 junior and mid-tier members, who had spent the past 9 days reading an archive that described the same pattern they had always suspected applied to themselves, and who voted with the particular force of people who had finally been handed the vocabulary for something they had known in their bodies for a long time. The chamber did not erupt. There was no celebration. There was instead a long, serious quiet, the quiet of something large and real settling into place, the way mountains settle permanently and without ceremony. In the weeks and months that followed, the Thermopylae's fabrication bays opened. Hera began, with the methodical patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment, transmitting sovereignty technical archives to human engineering teams who found themselves reading specifications that felt less like new discoveries and more like remembering, because that was exactly what it was. A new orbital shipyard took shape above Earth within a year, not a Concord-affiliated facility, but a sovereignty yard, building in methods that made visiting Concord engineers go quiet in the particular way of people confronting the gap between what they thought they knew and what turned out to be possible. The first new sovereignty vessel rolled out of the yard 14 months later. It was smaller than the Thermopylae because they were still learning, still restoring vocabulary before they could write in it fluently. But the design language was unmistakable, angular, purposeful, built without apology. They named her Marsh, after a signals intelligence officer who had intercepted the truth and given her crew enough warning to save it. Stood in the Thermopylae's hangar bay and watched the launch feed on a portable screen, eating a nutrition bar from a ration pack that was, for the first time in his professional life, labeled with a sovereignty emblem rather than a conquered one. It tasted exactly the same. He noticed this with a quiet amusement. "What are you thinking?" Hera asked. "I'm thinking about the photographs," he said. "In the crew quarters, the one of the old woman holding the baby." "I know the ones. I wonder if they made it, if they had good lives after everything." Hera was quiet for a moment. "I believe they did," she said. "I have spent 20,000 years believing they did. It seemed important to believe it." He nodded. On the screen, the Marsh cleared the shipyard and held station above Earth, which hung below it blue and white and ancient and permanent, unchanged by everything, carrying in its oceans and its soil the deep memory of everything that had happened on its surface and around it, undisturbed by the particular smallness of human history relative to the largeness of what humanity had always been and had now remembered being. "Dr. Hera said, what happens now?" He considered it. He looked at the ship on the screen. He thought about the captain's chair and the metal plates and the writing of someone who had known she was sending a message forward through 20 to a person she would never meet and had trusted, with the specific faith of someone who understood their own species deeply, that the right person would be there to receive it. "Now," he said, "we find out what we build when nobody is afraid of what we'll build next." He finished the nutrition bar. He went back to work. And in orbit above a capital world that was still adjusting to the new shape of things, in the silence between stars that had watched humanity be erased and watched humanity return, and were now, in the long, patient way of the universe, watching to see what came next, the Thermopylae held position. "Patient. Certainly. Home,"